What I'm excited to do now is actually bring a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of global perspective to the table. I'm going to ask Christelle and Seb to come up to the stage, and I'll just do a quick intro while they're coming up. Seb Ellsworth has been the founding CEO of Access, the Foundation for Social Investment in the UK since 2015. Access has transformed the flow of finance and enterprise support to community-scale charities and social enterprises in England through its pioneering blend of finance and capacity-building programs. Seb is widely regarded as a leader in the field and has co-founded both the Blended Finance Collective, a network of practitioners in London, and the Enterprise Grants Task Force, a movement of foundations supporting resilience in the sector through enterprise capacity building. There we go. Great. Christelle is a friend and an amazing human. And she's the CEO of the Equity Economic Development Group, an organization focused on supporting impact investment in private equity funds in diversifying their portfolios. She is the board chair of the Table of Impact Investing Practitioners of Canada. Let's hear it for Tip. And also chair of BOAN Social Impact, a Canadian social finance fund wholesaler that many of us know, and we're proud to call a partner. She is also a founding member of the Canadian Purpose Economy Project. Shout out for CPAP. You guys are like, what CPAP? Okay, come and talk to me later. We're talking CPAP later. An initiative that exists to accelerate the transition to the purpose economy, bringing corporations from across the country into the purpose economy movement. Without further ado, I'm going to hand this mic over to Christelle. Seb's got a mic, and we're ready to go.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Round of applause for Keith. Thank you. So thank you so much, everyone. Really excited about this morning's conversation with Seb Ellsworth. I'm really excited to learn about what is happening in the UK. Through our conversations leading up to this conversation, it's really been interesting to learn. And I think there's a lot of things that we can explore within the Canadian context to implement. So to kick things off, you are the founder and CEO of Access Social Investments. Can you share with us a little bit more about why you launched this, what it's about, and what you guys do?
Sure, thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. I've so enjoyed the many conversations I've had over the last few days, and it's great to see how the ecosystem is growing here in Canada. Yesterday there was quite a lot of references to it's a nascent field and we're a small ecosystem, and I'll reflect a little bit on our experience in the UK, but I don't think you should be so humble. I think this is fantastic how many people are in a room together here. If we held this event in London, I think there wouldn't be any more people in a room than there are here, and there's a lot of momentum I can see. So it's great to see that. Thank you for the question. So our journey began 10 years ago, and there had been a period of a great deal of support for the social impact investment ecosystem from the time that the then coalition government came into power in 2010. And they had built on work that the previous government had done and created, most significantly, an organisation that's now called Better Society Capital, originally called Big Society Capital, which is the national wholesale fund of funds for impact investing. And they were originally capitalised with about £600 million. It's grown somewhat over that period. And so they had begun their work. They had been investing in a number of different intermediaries. So they were obviously a fund of funds working through different fund managers, different vehicles, and had really built out started to build the social venture ecosystem, started to do a lot of work around social property, working with government around outcomes contracts. But for many community-scale social enterprises who were looking for simple, small-scale, unsecured finance, the dial hadn't really shifted. I can give you many examples, but one in Greater Manchester, organisation that's had a heritage of about 30 years supporting minoritised communities who are excluded from the labour market, excluded from economic opportunity, who needed a simple cash flow loan to help them with their customers who were always late at paying, needed to support their renovate some property so they could rent it out to community organizations who wanted to use that space. Really simple, very common needs for finance. Didn't have security, didn't have a track record in the eyes of organizations lending. So there was this real gap still in the flow of small-scale, patient, unsecured finance to community-scale social enterprises. And we really, Access's creation really was through a really kind of pretty forensic analysis as to why that finance wasn't flowing. There was money labeled impact. There were intermediaries, not enough, but there were fund managers who could do that work. So why wasn't the finance flowing? And essentially, there was a need for concessional finance. And when Access was created, it was determined to do three very specific things in terms of the flow of finance. So finance wasn't flowing because community-scale social enterprises are a risky proposition. You know, if you lend to 20 of them, 3, 4 of them aren't going to repay, not from their, you know, for the factors of the market they're operating in. It's an expensive, inefficient way of lending. You're lending lots of small amounts of money. There's lots of time building relationships and managing those flows. And often the business model of the social enterprise itself can't quite tolerate the repayments to justify the amount of capital that it needs. So their need for capital is greater than their ability to repay, and so it doesn't quite work. And so we were created to address those specific challenges and also to fund a range of capacity building programs that help to enable more organizations to access that finance. Originally funded through a direct grant from the government and from the National Lottery Community Fund. More recently, we've started to receive money through the Dormant Asset Scheme, which is money laying dormant in bank accounts that's been freed up. And since 2015, we've committed £160 million into a whole variety of these different initiatives around England.
Amazing. That's really interesting to hear about you guys utilizing these dormant funds to be able. What does that look like in terms of scale yearly, and how much are you guys able to deploy?
Yeah, so our role is to deploy the concessional layer in a whole variety of different blended finance funds. We've worked with about 24 different fund managers around the UK. Some of them are operating in particular geographies, so it might be across Greater Manchester or across Bristol. Others are taking a thematic approach, so we've got some funds focused on homelessness, we've got some focused on sports-based and sports-based social enterprises, and others are generic kind of national providers of that loan finance. In total, so far, the funds that we've supported, including some of the capacity building work, has reached over 3,000 organisations right around the country. And in terms of impact, every 2 years, Social Enterprise UK, the national trade body, do a big state of the sector survey, kind of what are the opportunities in the social enterprise sector, what are the barriers. In 2011, in the kind of environment in which Access was created, when you ask social enterprises about the barriers they faced, 45% of them said that the number one barrier was access to finance. Fast forward 10 years, that same survey was undertaken again in 2021. Only 6% said that access to finance was the main barrier. So there's been a significant shift in terms of the supply of that particular piece of the market, the small-scale, flexible, unsecured finance for social enterprises at a community level.
Incredible. And then so now that it's, you know, as you're mentioning some of the items that have happened within the last 10 years, it has been 10 years officially now since Access has been around. You touched on some of the different reports that the impact that you guys have had. Can you dive a little bit more deeper in terms of some other concrete impacts that you've seen over the last 10 years since the organization has been around?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's been a number of changes, I guess, in the market for the intermediary fund managers as well. So we've seen a growing number of organizations playing that role. Some are experienced lenders and are moving more into serving a market for social enterprises. Others are kind of not-for-profit networks or membership organizations that have a particular connectivity into certain communities, and so we're wanting to build the capacity to be a lender, to be a sort of particular kind of enterprise capacity building support organization. And that's been, that's really significant in terms of reaching communities that can't otherwise access finance. but there are still challenges around their resilience as intermediaries, and probably one of the lessons for us is kind of how we continue to boost the resilience of those fund managers to make sure they can continue to do this work in the future.
That makes sense. It's interesting because within the Canadian landscape, we too, naturally, there's been all these different vehicles, organizations, funding, fund managers that have created various funds that are to serve underrepresented groups, underfunded communities, through region, through language, through income. And so I'm curious to know, with Access, or what you're seeing within the UK landscape, when it comes to blended capital support, how are you guys doing that for equity-deserving groups?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and a really big part of our thinking. So we had to take two lenses to that. The first is a kind of geographic lens, and I don't know how many people here know England well, but it's a remarkably unequal country. I mean, spatially unequal. So, very wealthy cities and extremely deprived towns, particularly often coastal towns or communities kind of on the periphery of the large cities. And so part of our focus is to channel money specifically into the communities that most need capital. There are various government metrics for deprivation, and there's one that we track against. And when you look at where the organizations are operating that we're funding and the degree of poverty in those communities, there is a kind of perfect correlation between most money going to the poorest parts of the country. Now, that everyone who works with social enterprises perhaps won't be terribly surprised by that, but it is worth kind of just thinking that is the inverse of normal flows of capital. And that is one of the things that blended finance can uniquely well do, which I think, from a public policy point of view, has been a really important part of our story in managing to get more money from government to continue our work. And then looking at particularly serving minoritized communities and ethnically minoritized communities around the UK, that's been an increasingly kind of big part of our work as well. And to do that, we've really had to start to understand some of the really granular barriers that have prevented minoritized communities from accessing finance. There was a really good example during the pandemic where lots of good intention went into creating access to finance for different communities, which social enterprise fund managers were able to utilize as well. And there was a particular loan fund, the Resilience and Recovery Loan Fund, that was established to support social enterprises to access finance during the pandemic. And it had a particularly poor take-up rate from black and minoritized communities. And everyone involved in this fund was, very concerned to see that data point. And the organization that ran the fund, Social Investment Business, did a really good job of kind of analyzing what specifically had been the barrier here to these communities accessing finance. And it was a particular aspect of eligibility around organizational size to be able to benefit from a guarantee, which in these minoritized communities, which obviously had multi-generational lack of access to finance, didn't have the balance sheets in those organizations to meet that eligibility criteria, particularly fell into the sort of ineligible category. And so what we did with SIB kind of going forward when they built their successor fund was to develop a very targeted grant program that was specifically focused on enabling black and minoritized organizations that would otherwise fall under the threshold of that eligibility to boost their balance sheet to the sufficient level to become eligible for the guarantee and therefore access the finance that other organizations could do so through the guarantee scheme. So that's quite a good example of a really targeted application of grant to overcome a barrier that was never intended to work in that way. And the panel yesterday briefly touched on Islamic finance, and this has been an area of our work as well. So we work particularly deeply in Bradford, which is a city in West Yorkshire with a high proportion of Muslim residents, about 30% Muslim. And our partners there were clear that if we were going to reach the community properly, we had to develop a Sharia-compliant loan product that would enable Muslim-led social enterprises to be able to access finance as well. So our partner there, the Key Fund, worked with a consultancy to develop the very detailed specifics of a product that would be authorized as Sharia compliant. There's particular ways in which the grant element of the blended structure essentially compensates for interest income that the fund manager will otherwise receive, so that the underlying social enterprise doesn't pay interest on the debt. That's been a long process, and we're just starting to see that bearing fruit now. Yeah, those are a couple of examples of how we've tried to tackle those challenges.
That's fantastic, and it's really interesting because I see some correlation within the Canadian landscape as well when I think about some of the initiatives that were launched here specifically to address some of those communities as well. You look at the federal loan fund that was launched specifically to help Black entrepreneurs. Again, there were reports out that demonstrated challenges to access to capital. You see the Ravens Outcomes Fund, they're specifically targeting diabetes within the Indigenous communities. And then even BDC, a development fund working on Thrive. They have a Thrive fund, I believe, launch, and that's specifically for women to help them have access to capital. And so it's interesting to see how governments are working in tandem to help create these funds, but then we definitely need that private investment as well to have that catalytic growth that can really happen. So just to continue on what you were saying, for you guys and what you're seeing as well in the UK landscape, how involved are the private investors as well in this conversation? Are the pension funds at the table as well? What does that look like?
So we've definitely seen a broadening of the range of co-investors that we're working with. So to be really specific, our role is to create opportunities for other investors to opt to invest in loan funds serving community scale social enterprises by de-risking it to a sufficient point that they ought to be able to feel that they can participate in that. So originally, the main co-investor was Better Society Capital. Then it started to be a broader range of other impact investors, foundations thinking about their endowment allocations and so on. We've then started to see a number of, I guess you'd sort of values-aligned banks, so social banks, playing that role. And in some cases, they are able to utilize a tax relief as well, community investment tax relief. So overall, that package does become quite attractive. The hope, of course, over time is that we will be able to attract more mainstream banks, other financial institutions to play that role. I think we still have a challenge around scale. The largest funds that we support are around, we're providing a grant layer of maybe £4 or £5 million. The fund itself maybe is totaling kind of £10 to £12 million. So the biggest kind of ticket for senior debt is probably still less than £10 million, and that's pretty challenging for many financial institutions. So the conversation's starting about how we think about different aggregation mechanisms, how we think about building bigger funds that are targeting kind of broader impact areas, and then focusing specific elements of that on community scale social enterprises. Pension funds more generally are playing more of a role in impact investing in the kind of broader impact investing landscape, and particularly there's an expectation that pension funds from local government agencies that are managing the pensions of people based in a particular part of the country invest in infrastructure, economic development opportunities in that region, and that's something which the government are encouraging pension funds to do more of. We're still at the more challenging end of the market, I think, from an institutional point of view, and we've still got some way to go.
Makes sense. And with that being said, then, what are some of the learnings that you've had? You have been working in this space for quite some time now. Yeah. What are some key learnings that you've had through this time?
Yeah, and there's a danger I'm going to get quite geeky here.
Please do.
I'm hoping a room full of people who've come to a 2-day conference on blended finance won't mind me getting a bit geeky about blended finance. So, I mean, there's a whole set of learnings around how we allocate the grant, right? And we're trying to do some very specific things in the way we put grant into these blended finance structures. And crucially, it's about minimum concessionality. So, we need to do enough, put enough grant in to solve the problem we're trying to solve. But if we put too much in, that's, an inefficient use of resources and risks some market distortion. You might say, kind of what market? But there is that challenge as well. So the crucial piece, of course, is the loss protection. So we're putting a first loss layer into these loan funds, and that does vary a lot across the whole portfolio of different funds that we've put money into. So some are targeting default rates of 10% or less, others are 30, 35% or more, and that really depends on the community that's being served, the scale of the fund, the experience of the fund manager and their track record, and who the co-investor is, and our kind of comfort with the degree of risk mitigation that we should give them. So if it's a bank lending the deposits of other non-profits or trade unions or whatever it might be, we kind of get that they need a pretty decent level of risk mitigation. If it's a very aligned impact investor foundation who already has a very clear mission to serve that market, we might take a slightly different view and expect to see a greater sharing of that risk. So there's a lot of thinking goes into the way we present proposals in our investment committee around kind of getting that level of risk mitigation right. And we have done some guarantees as well, funded guarantees. It's not all first loss. We've tended to prefer to do a first loss layer on the basis that money then gets deployed to the social enterprises rather than just hanging back, waiting for defaults to happen. But I think as our work evolves, we need to look more into the way guarantee mechanisms can be used, because there's probably more efficient ways of doing that. We're obviously talking about blended structures here, but those blended structures do also enable blended products. And we've seen a whole variety of different ways that fund managers deploy those blended products. So the best examples are where the product that they're offering to social enterprises is a loan. It's advertised as a loan. People come to those fund managers expecting a loan. And it's then in the application process and the due diligence process that the fund manager will say, yeah, but you really can't tolerate that degree of repayment. Or you think you want 80 grand, but you really need 120 grand, don't you? And then they can start to introduce a grant element into the blend. If it's advertised as a blend, then it doesn't always create the right incentives in our experience. Obviously, social enterprises want more grant in the mix, but we think that the best model is when it's you start on the assumption it's zero and you build it up as it's needed rather than the other way around. But some of our fund managers kind of really push hard on wanting to advertise the grant element because they think that gets more organizations in through the door and to build their pipeline. So there's a bit of tension there about kind of what we think that grant should be for and what some of the partners think it should be for. And then finally, kind of the amount of grant that we've put into the intermediaries themselves as direct grant. I mean, they basically generate their fees off running the fund, but in the early days, probably the first 18 months, it's unlikely they're generating enough revenue from the loans that have been made, and so we particularly subsidize that period. And I think the lesson is probably we've not been generous enough in that. Some of our fund managers are, they're amazing organizations, but their own resilience probably hasn't been built as much as we need it to be as the system matures. There's recently been a very unfortunate incident that one of our partners in Greater Manchester has gone into administration. We think we'll be able to preserve the social investment activity there, but it's been a very challenging period for everybody. So we really need to think more deeply about that resilience piece in kind of how we deploy some of those grants. And then I think finally one of the tensions in this blended finance community is are we talking about permanent subsidy or are we talking about temporary subsidy? Is this something that we can prove out a market? We do this for a few years, we can prove out a market and other people can come in, or are we, is this going to be needed for the long run? And we're pretty clear of the view that the market we're serving, community scale social enterprises, often in marginalized communities, that's a permanent need for subsidy. Hopefully we can get better at deploying it effectively and efficiently, and we can be more and increasingly targeted, and we can try to align other government tools like guarantees to play the role they can play. But I think it's important in this conversation to be clear this isn't going to go away. This is a permanent subsidy need.
Right. And what would you say on average when you are providing, when your fund managers are assessing the deals and part of it is just a loan. What's the average between the amount that's loaned and the amount that you guys actually subsidize as grants?
Yeah, so
does that look
the blended deals, so some of them have no grant in at all.
Okay.
Others are maybe sort of typically 80-20, so 80% debt, 20% grant.
Yeah.
We're pretty clear that it has to be at least 50% debt. But it does vary. And some of our programs are more specifically focused on targeting particular challenges in business models.
Okay.
And we've got a recent program that's focused on supporting community organizations to go through energy retrofit exercises to try to reduce their energy bills, to make their buildings more efficient. And we're quite generous on the grant in that fund at the deal level because it was partly a response to the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis that we've had and the impact that had on community organizations, and we wanted that to be cash positive in the short term as well as the long term. But that was a slightly unusual choice for us. So in the deals, it's generally 30% or less.
Right.
And then in the fund as a whole, there will be a level of loss protection somewhere between sort of 10 to 30% generally.
Great. Thank you for that. So, you've shared with us some of the things that you've learned over time. We see some of the solutions that's evident with what blended finance can do in transforming social purpose organizations, marginalized communities, and being able to accelerate economies. With that, what challenges do you still see remaining within the space for it to really grow? Yeah,
so I mentioned one of them already in terms of the kind of relationship with senior co-investors. But there are, I think, also some challenges persist around other sources of the concessional finance as well. And it's interesting reflecting on our journey and our creation that it's obviously facilitated a lot of lending to community organizations. But I sometimes wonder whether having a relatively large national institution like us doing that work maybe has slightly meant that others who ought to be at that table haven't felt the need to step up. And what's encouraging about this conversation is the breadth of folks in the room and sort of other foundations here. I think our existence has perhaps been an excuse for some other foundations in the UK not to step up and do this work. And that is often then explained with, it's all terribly difficult, you're subsidizing investors' return, and our trustees could never get comfortable with that. And I think that, that's a really simple argument to debunk, right? We're not subsidizing an investor's return. We're allowing the investor to make the return in a market they can't otherwise serve. And that's a really important distinction that kind of we need to continue to make. So there are challenges in the relationship with foundations and how they play more of a role. And what we're trying to do is say, we get that you may not want to jump straight into providing first loss capital in a blended fund, right? That's a bit of a leap. But fundamentally, this is all about helping nonprofits to be more enterprising, help them to develop more income from enterprising activity. And as a grant maker, are you thinking creatively about how you can encourage that in ways that are perhaps more in line with what you do already? And so Keith mentioned the Enterprise Grants Task Force that we've helped to convene, which is really a body of foundations coming together and saying, what are the ways in which we can use our grant-making tools to help more nonprofits develop their enterprise model in a kind of highly incentivized way, perhaps build their capability to get ready to take on finance over time. So there's definitely a piece around foundations. And I think one of the other things that's an ongoing challenge is just how this whole sector relates to the nonprofit sector itself. I mean, we've been on a kind of silly journey really over the last 15 years, and because this market grew a lot during a period of austerity, there was a kind of narrative 15 years ago of, you're going to lose those local authority grants, but don't worry because social impact investing is going to be here to save the day. And that was a crazy argument for a nonprofit because they're like, well, hang on, that was revenue and you're offering me a loan, and like, how does that work? So we've really tried to kind of tone down the talk about investment when we talk about our work. We talk about enterprise, we talk about resilience, we talk about income diversity, and that resonates much more strongly, of course, with civil society organizations. We've tried to build out navigation tools to help them to better find their way through which is the right product, which is the right fund manager, kind of how do they work through the market. And then really building the skills of the networks and the infrastructure organizations to talk about enterprise models in a more sophisticated way. Like we talked about homelessness earlier. How many ways are there to earn revenue out in a homelessness nonprofit? There aren't actually that many, and they've all been done before by somebody. So how do we kind of build out the knowledge base in a way that sort of means that people aren't starting from scratch? And so that's a kind of big part of our work going forward.
Great. I think it's really helpful because with us in Canadian landscape, we know there's a pending election and that nonprofits are going to have to find ways to pivot, not depend so much on government for grants or for funding, and finding other ways. And even I think there's going to be a potential shift in language and conversation. And to your point about the kind of terms you use, that's going to be something that organizations are going to have to think about, and how they position themselves to ensure that they can get investments. So I know I think I saw Christy there. So can you just share with us some final key messages and final thoughts? No? Okay.
We're all scared.
Everyone is afraid.
As soon as you stand up.
Yeah, we're like.
But I can give you a time check. At about 10:15, we'd like to open up for questions.
Excellent. Okay. I don't even know what time it is.
10 past.
Okay, we're good.
Yeah.
But yeah, just some additional key messages and final thoughts, really, that we haven't had the chance to touch on.
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple of things perhaps I'll say. I mean, one is the power of community, and one of the reasons I was so keen to come and join you was that we are ourselves in the process of convening a blended finance community of practice in the UK. And obviously, I wanted to listen to the conversation, but I also kind of wanted to see how you were doing this, because we'll be stealing ideas to bring back home. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting about that is that we've brought together both the domestic impact investing world with the development finance world based in London, and we've just operated in ridiculous silos for so long. We're funded by different donors. We work with different bits of government. We obviously deploy money in different geographies, and so that conversation has been so enlightening. We've used slightly different language. In most cases, they're way ahead in terms of the sophistication of financial products that they're using, and so so I think kind of building out the community to other aligned parts of the ecosystem that are doing similar work has been a really important part of it. And then I think the point that Wayne made earlier about this is really a tool, right? And it's I love talking about the tool. Don't get me wrong, but I think particularly for nonprofits, but also for in our experience for foundations kind of wanting to come into this space, we need to start, and this is something I've learned to do, tried to do better. We really need to start with the story about impact and what we're trying to achieve, and then the application of the tool starts to make sense. There's a great example in the UK that we weren't involved with, so I can talk about it in glowing terms. An initiative to tackle the poverty premium. So people on low incomes tend to pay more for essential goods, and it was a venture program to support interventions that would tackle that particular challenge. And that was an amazing example of foundations, sort of highly concessional social investors, impact investors coming together and saying, yeah, we all believe this is a major problem and we all have a reason to be at the table, and let's use our different tools. And that framing around a very clear problem enabled a partnership to evolve. Whereas if you'd started the foundation conversation with, do you want to be a first loss layer in a fund? They, obviously wouldn't have come to the table. So I think, that's definitely a journey we've been on there.
Wonderful. And just one more question. How are the conversations going with the development banks? What does that look like? And how are they tend to be a little bit less risky in terms of how they invest. Can you just touch on what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, my knowledge is somewhat secondhand through this network that we're part of. But I think that's exactly right. Their mandates have been, arguably more conservative than they need to be in terms of the markets they're trying to serve. And so the organisation that we work with in the Blended Finance Collective in London is British International Investments, which is the UK's DFI. And they have a variety of quite innovative financing tools that they're starting to think about, both in terms of technical assistance, the way they play a blended role in attracting other finance into their deals. And I think the same is true of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which are part of that network as well. So there are some good examples, I think, but yeah, it's definitely a journey.
Wonderful. Well, Mr. Seb Ellsworth, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. I would like to open up the floor for questions.
Here. Thanks. A few minutes ago, you mentioned that you tend to place more of the loss risk on the foundations rather than the banks. I'm having a little trouble like understanding why we wouldn't, stick it to the big banks.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and we, I think we sometimes, like everyone in the room, right? We believe in rewiring the financial system to better serve social enterprises, and I think, we sometimes ask ourselves whether we are not rewiring that system, but simply enabling the system to continue to operate as it is and just mitigating some of those challenges. I think, it might be the right or wrong approach, but I think what we're trying to do is find a way to bring some of those organizations to the table to learn about a market that they're not otherwise serving, because without that carrot, they're not going to come to the table. We've spent years trying to build these vehicles in a way that we think we understand the reason you're not coming, and so let's do it this way, let's do it that way, let's try and bring you to the table. And it's still really hard. The honest answer might be they don't want to come to the table. Many of them don't want to come to the table, right? And so, maybe we need to focus our attention elsewhere. I think that's not universally true, and I think some of them can and some of them will. So, it's a really good challenge. Whether it's the right approach, I'm not sure. But what we're trying to do is say, we get that you will need to be really comfortable doing this for the first time at a scale that probably doesn't really make sense for you. So let's try and do that, and then let's see where that journey takes them.
See.
Hi, thanks so much, Seb. I'm David Schwartz from Convergence Blended Finance. I have a question. I'm curious, in the funds that your fund-to-fund has been supporting, what has been the tenor of them? So have you been able to use longer tenors as part of the de-risking strategy? And I'd be curious to hear a little bit about your experience with technical assistance as also de-risking, and whether that's had an impact in crowding in more of the commercial capital.
Yeah. So the typical tenor of the funds are, the underlying loans are kind of 3 to 5 years, maybe up to 7. They'll have a deployment period the funds will have a deployment period of they say they'll deploy in 3, they usually deploy in 5, and then we're in the runoff period after that. There have been some variations there, serving different parts of the market, and some attempts to kind of build evergreen funds that have a kind of continual supply of subsidy over time. That's obviously quite complex. I think the particular kind of key point about that is what it means for the underlying social enterprise business model and their ability to repay over those kinds of terms. And we see some where they model in a bullet, which then needs to be refinanced, and that becomes challenging as well. So I think if you look at the overall kind of picture of which bits of the market still need support, we are solving some problems in terms of a certain kind of fairly vanilla loan, but there are plenty of other parts of the market. There was conversations yesterday about community asset development. We're not doing enough of that, and so there's definitely a challenge there. In terms of technical assistance, we have a particular technical assistance program called the REACH Fund, which is a grant program that is aligned with the social investment fund manager. Again, it's not advertised as a grant program. If you're a non-profit, you go to the fund manager, you're looking for a loan, but they have the ability to refer the non-profit into this grant program if they think they need that kind of support. It's not huge grants. It's typically £10,000 to £15,000, and it's usually to fund the financial modeling, cash flow forecasting, quite specific work. So this is an organization that already has a revenue model, but the actual taking on of debt is the piece that needs to be supported. We thought long and hard about the design of that, and there have been other programs in the UK, either where that technical assistance capacity is rooted in the fund manager, or you're funding sort of corporate finance consultancies to do that work directly. And we felt that the incentives of either of those two examples wasn't quite right, because for most of these nonprofits, it's the first time they've ever borrowed, and we thought it was really important that the advice was separate from where the debt was coming from, and that agency was really kind of clear that you can take the advice, and then it's a totally different decision about whether or not you take on the debt. There's no relationship between those two things. We felt that was really important. And we've seen previous examples where the support was based in relatively large kind of nonprofit consultancies, where honestly that wasn't very good at driving value for money in the system. And what we've done through the Reach Fund is enable nonprofits to receive a grant to buy support, usually from local trusted organizations. And it's actually driven down the cost without compromising quality, as far as we can tell. And that program, as the last evaluation suggested, that for every £1 spent on that capacity building, £7 had been raised that wouldn't have otherwise been raised into the sector. So that's supported about 1,000 organisations over that period. We've done other technical assistance work that's more early stage, so supporting enterprise development in different sectors. But I think the Reach Fund is very much aligned to the blended structure, but slightly separate from it. It could definitely be done in other ways, but for various reasons, we felt that was the right solution.
A few more questions?
Hi, Seb. David Maggs from the Metcalf Foundation. We're looking at trying to bring this work into the cultural sector in Canada that has really steered away from repayable finance of any kind. And our worry is not on the supply side, it's demand side readiness that we're really worried about. The difference, I think people sometimes look at the need for capital and use that to believe that there's also a desire and readiness for loans. And so I'm just particularly interested in the work that you're doing to try and build that entrepreneurial capacity in the nonprofit investees, and wondering if you can take us into the grittier details of what that work has entailed and maybe some of the inflection points between success and failure there.
Great, and so we have had one partnership specifically focused on arts and culture organisations in the UK, and I think one of the interesting things is that for all, totally agree with your analysis, but the reality is those are organisations that often do actually have a relationship with revenue that's quite different from other nonprofits. So there's kind of potential there. So we've had an initiative called the Enterprise Development Programme. It's run for about 6 years, and it's worked in particular themes and to some degree a geographical lens as well, but mainly thematic. And that's because we've felt that the opportunity to bring organisations together working in similar markets creates the space for those conversations to evolve in a more bespoke way. There's been a big focus on peer learning and sort of surfacing the elements within organisations about the relationship between revenue and cost and cross-subsidy and all of those kinds of things. I think trying to make the conversation, I think that the conversation is often very unsophisticated. It's right, you're a charity or you're a social enterprise, and the reality is almost no one is at either end of that spectrum. Pretty much everyone's in the middle, and what proportion of your income is coming from trading activity, and how does that increase over time? So big focus on creating space for those conversations. We've partnered with an organisation called School for Social Entrepreneurs and Social Investment Business to run grants alongside that. And we've piloted all sorts of ways of making those grants really incentivised to encourage the development of enterprise activity. There's a bit of a fundamental contradiction in giving an organisation a grant to help them to develop their enterprise capability. And we've tried to sort of say, okay, we recognise that's a tension, but there are good ways of doing it and less good ways of doing it. And so School for Social Entrepreneurs have piloted a model called match trading, where you literally align the deployment of the grant with annual uplift in earned income. So if their trading income was £50,000 last year and it's £60,000 this year, you reward that 10K earned income increase with additional 10K of grant. It has its own challenges. You can end up subsidizing sort of fundamentally unprofitable revenue models there, but for the entrepreneur, it keeps them focused on earning that income rather than going off over here and applying for grants. So that's one tool that has had some success in some circumstances, but I would, it's not a silver bullet. One of the things that we did some of, but wished we'd done more of, was paying for really intensive it was kind of consultancy, but really intensive consultancy where we would basically place temporary finance directors in nonprofits and really help them to just build the tools and sophistication around their finance capability to manage enterprise income. And we had we identified really a handful of people who were excellent at doing that work, really understood the kind of challenge that they were tasked with undertaking. We should have done more of that because that was probably the most impactful thing that we did in those programs.
We'll take one more please.
Sorry. Thanks so much for the conversation. My name is Vinod Rajasekharan. I'm with Future of Good. We're in a pretty volatile political landscape in right, and we've enjoyed the benefits of the last decade or so of the Trudeau government, and possible switch to a conservative government sometime this year. And curious to hear, are there a couple of insights you could share with us that would help us build a strong case and language and the political oxygen to accelerate some of this work with a possible conservative government?
Yeah, no, great question, and it's interesting that the original environment that led to the creation of Better Society Capital was the last Labour government. It was a conservative Liberal Democrat coalition that actually got that over the line and created my organisation. We then had a conservative government, until last year, and then a Labour government back again. I'd say for the first part of that history, from both major political parties in the UK, there was a genuine interest in building this ecosystem almost as an end in itself, and hence, the dormant asset money flowing into this space, the creation of these national institutions, a whole load of work around outcomes contracts and social impact bonds, and so on. And I think that was, a sort of a policy goal in and of itself, with the assumption that it would lead to some good things happening. After probably the Brexit referendum and the Theresa May government was the big change where, this was no longer considered interesting of itself. It was interesting in as much as it delivered stuff that government cared about. And for us, that argument has been about economic opportunity in deprived communities. So we don't really talk about social impact with government. We talk about economic impact, and I have a graph that is, the poorest parts of the country and where our money goes, and that's the main thing I spend time talking to them about. And there's a whole load of evidence that sits behind that in terms of the ability of social enterprises to create more jobs per turnover, jobs that pay living wage, jobs that keep money circulating in the local economy, all of those kinds of things. So that's been a really crucial part of the narrative for us. I think it's probably fair to say that the new government brings a slightly warmer tone to the conversation, but yet to see much action. I think to be totally honest, for us that's mainly around the next tranche of dormant assets and kind of how that flows into this space. Dormant assets particularly is helpful because it kind of is directed by government, but it's not public money, so it doesn't have quite the same political vagrancies perhaps that other pots of money do. And I think it's really important to try and keep that away from the political cycle. So we hope that will work. But yeah, I mean, for a more conservative government, it was an economic development story that we told, and we had some success with.
Last one.
Thank you, Christine.
Last one.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. Alex Tveit, Sustainable Impact Foundation. First of all, thank you for intentionally engaging across borders, because we really need that dialogue to be more and really intentional. You spoke about having the issue with being fragmented and siloed. So I have two quick questions that are really adjacent. One is really to move towards having knowledge mobilization to understand community needs and transparency in capital flows for two purposes. Layering on community needs and transparency in capital flows so that we understand mismatches between the two, as well as inequities that persist. So that's the one side, and really interested in how you're moving towards understanding that mismatches and inequities. And then related to that knowledge mobilization, are you doing work across grantee or beneficiary portfolios to understand how can you move knowledge and understanding across portfolios so that you can help full domains with understanding and navigating the issues?
Yeah, great questions, and I think probably the quick answer on both is not enough. But on the kind of cross portfolio work, I mean, it's interesting bringing our intermediaries together, just for their own space to learn and reflect and think about the kind of challenges that they experience, and that often surfaces some really quite fundamental issues around the way the nonprofits that they're lending to, need their capacity built, the kind of challenges they're experiencing in the markets that they're operating in, both kind of thematic markets and geographical markets. So we do quite a lot of that work, and then try to sort of surface that with some of the other ecosystem players that we work with. I think we recognise that there are some things we're quite good at, and there are sort of broader things that we're not necessarily the best place organisation to take forward some of the discussions. So we're operating in a network where there are kind of leading infrastructure organisations doing that kind of community development work. There sort of representative bodies that perhaps are a better place to kind of take some of that work forward. So when we think of our kind of ecosystem map, we've got kind of flows of capital, we've also got kind of flows of influence and what that looks like at different scales, and try to build those partnerships as much as we can, but not enough, I think, and it was a good challenge.
Well, thank you so much for being here, sharing with us your knowledge, your experience. It's been a lovely pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you for
Please,
having
round
me.
of applause.
Thank you.